welcome, folks. My name is Ryan. I'm with Sans Duh. I have my illustrious co-host Mary on with me today. Hi, Mary. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. You know how much I love these shows. For anyone just tuning in, if you're not yet familiar, how dare you? This is our monthly, and for that matter, the July 2025 episode of the Sans Stay Ahead of Ransomware live stream, where we bring on a guest or two or five and talk about some topic that's hot, maybe hotly debated, maybe some new evolved tactics, whatever, in relation to ransomware. It's a scourge. It keeps it, as in the threat actor groups, keep evolving. We see more and more. It's still a problem. It's not going away. And we're here to basically talk through some of the things that we're seeing in the field. So again, my name is Ryan Chapman, by the way. I go by RJ_Chap. I'm the author of SANS Forensics 528, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion. I also teach Forensics 610, Reverse Engineering Malware. And I co-host, in fact, including this last year or this past 2 months ago or whatever it was, with Mary, the 2025 Ransomware Summit. We've had 4 years of our Ransomware Summit. We do this stream monthly. We're trying to bring you all the content we can related to ransomware to ensure that you can better prevent, deter, detect, and hopefully not have to, but respond to ransomware. So, Mary, if you want to give yourself an intro here.
Yep, absolutely. Ryan, I am out here in Tucson, Arizona, and I think this is kind of where you usually ask where everybody is from as well. But I teach the ransomware course as well as Windows Forensic Analysis, the 4500 course. In fact, I'll be teaching at the end of this month at the D1 Summit, as well as doing a keynote out there. So I'm super excited about that. I work at a company called IDX as a consultant, where doing a lot of what Ryan says, responding to and helping clients through various ransomware incidents.
Thank you, Mary. For my day job, I work as a threat hunter, a team lead on a managed threat hunting services team. Prior to that, I worked in incident response consulting, and I've been doing DFIR for around 13 years or so now. Mary and I have known one another for I don't know how many years now, 7, 8 years, something like that. She's
A
like, yeah.
long time, a long time.
No, it's too long knowing you, Ryan. So on this episode, we are going to get into a discussion concerning threat actor profiling and how that relates to the overall cyber threat landscape, and of course, specifically to ransomware. I would like to welcome everyone who has tuned in or will be watching this recording later. We would love to see your comments and especially your questions throughout this episode. So please, whatever medium you're using to tune in today, LinkedIn, YouTube, other that for some reason I'm not thinking of right now, like drop those comments, drop those questions. We love to see them, and we will address whatever we can as we go along. If the folks that are live right now are able to let us know where you're coming from around the world, we'd be very, very interested. I love that cybersecurity, whether you want to call us InfoSec, cybersecurity, whatever, is such a global thing, but when it really comes down to it, it's a small world. Many times we see and identify people and say, wait a minute, I know them from so-and-so or from this conference or whatever. And that is actually the case today. So our guest today, who we're going to bring on now, is quite the perfect guest for our particular episode. So very happy to introduce Kurtis Minder. He is the founder and CEO of GroupSense. He's also the author of an up-and-coming book entitled Cyber Recon: My Life in Cyber Espionage and Ransomware Negotiation. He's a technologist and negotiator, which I think is really, really cool. And he's also a motorcyclist. So, Kurtis, hello, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. That's a lot of pressure, Ryan.
I have a, we're all in various Slack groups and Discord groups and, whatever, trying to, ingrain ourselves within the cybersecurity community. And when Mary was like, check out this Kurtis guy. I think he'd be great for an episode. I was like, well, let me check. And I went into one of my groups that I love the most, and I searched your name, and the first thing that I saw was a comment speaking very highly of you from Mr. Alan Liska, Mr. Alan Ransomware Sommelier Liska, who we've had on for I don't know how many different webcasts and ransomware summits, and he was a keynote one year, and I was like, oh, there it is, small world, there it is right there. Curtis is the guy. Go, Mary, say hello.
He's a character, Alan. I love that guy.
Yeah. Oh, we all love Alan. But it was just one of those small world moments. So, Curtis, you are a negotiator. So before we get into talking about profiling and all that, I know that many folks out there are wondering, what is that like to be actively engaged with cyber criminals?
I mean, it can be, sometimes it's fun, because there's a bit of a sort of competition, if you will. But a lot of times it's stressful. In addition to doing the actual negotiation part of it, I'm often acting as almost like a therapist to the victims. And that makes it pretty emotional sometimes, depending on the client, of course. Since most of our clients are quite large, they're brought to us by law firms and cyber insurance companies and stuff like that. On the side, I do a lot of nonprofit and pro bono work for small institutions. So I see both sides of the spectrum, and it can be pretty emotional.
That is awesome to hear about your pro bono work, by the way.
Yeah.
In my little research, I didn't see that. So maybe I just Google failed, but that is really, really cool. I very much appreciate hearing that folks such as yourself are doing that. And in one of my recent organizations that I won't mention, there's a negotiation team internally. And I was tapped, hey, do you want to negotiate with these folks? And at first I was like, oh, the adventure. Yeah. And then I realized if I break OPSEC in any way, shape, or form, and they're like, that's that Sands guy who has the class who hates us.
Right.
Like, I better not do that, man. I better just avoid that. So what are some of the things that you've kind of learned about the actors that you engage with, from communicating with them for so long now?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, and if we ever have a beer, Ryan, I'll tell you the whole story. Or Mary, the way the group since got into this particular discipline was almost entirely by accident, and we were sort of kicking and screaming, getting dragged into this in the beginning. So when we started, a lot of the negotiation skills I was bringing to the table were just from reading some good books, like Getting to Yes or something like, you know what I mean? Like, I've been in customer facing roles. So everybody has a little bit of that kind of, skill set. When it was right around when the New Yorker did the profile on me that we had a lot of inbounds from some of the negotiation leaders. So, folks coming out of the Harvard negotiation project, some of the, top negotiators at the FBI, both, the ones that were currently there and some that have retired, and have had the pleasure of interacting quite a bit with, for example, Chris Voss, who wrote the book Never Split the Difference. And so it went from, frankly, almost winging it, and over a 5-year period, a real scientific discipline about how to engage with the threat actors. I think, to answer your question, it's a long answer, but to answer your question, I think the thing that is most important to remember is that they're human beings. For the most part, they're using AI and stuff now too, but for the most part, we're dealing with humans, and understanding sort of where they're coming from, and maybe trying to understand, not always, but trying to understand their why and their motivation is pretty key to driving a result.
Ryan, I don't know if you remember, but in the Ransomware Summit, there was a conversation behind that, the motivation, why these threat actors get into doing this. The countries that they come from and maybe the opportunities that they have there are different than what we have here. And so I imagine, a lot of that comes into play when you're talking to them to try and figure out some of that.
Yeah, and I think I like to make the distinction. We don't have to have sympathy for them, but maybe empathy, right? And so it's a subtle difference, right? So I'm not condoning what they're doing because of their background or whatever, but understanding the why and their motivation and where they might be coming from a mental perspective is really powerful.
I noticed that Mr. John DiMaggio commented, and hi, by the way, thanks for hanging out with us. And I'm sure
that's even more pressure that John DiMaggio is on here. He's going to heckle me.
I'm sure yeah. So I know that, speaking of John DiMaggio and contacting threat actors and, communications with them and realizing, I love that you said that they're humans. You
Yeah.
know, when I first got into incident response, or I should say, wasn't consulting, but first party, my first foray was looking through, I think back then it was Carbon Black, and we
Mm,
were watching the threat actor actively type in a terminal window. Like we had some cool stuff going on at the time, and we
right.
saw all these mistakes. We saw like mess up and then literally run a man. Well, at the time I think it was slash question mark in Windows. But the point being is it was my first like, okay, this is an APT actor in an
Right.
environment. They think it's a real host. It's actually a deception host, but holy crud, I'm seeing what they're doing. And as they were doing it, I'm like, wait a minute. Like you're learning as you go. Like that's what
Yeah.
I do, right?
Not as sophisticated as you expected, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and even then, that was an APT actor. It wasn't just
Right.
some, back in 2011, 12, the cybercrime actors was like, oh, we don't have to worry about cybercrime. Okay. Fast forward to now.
Right.
So yeah, you also mentioned acting as a therapist to the victims. So I was a trainer in a call center for 7 years while I was going to do my college thing, and I thought one of the things I taught was soft skills. And I
Mhm.
used to have to teach empathy and relating back to the customer and things of that nature. And I'm sure that you have to implement a ton of that essentially in your negotiations.
Yeah, in both directions. Being very conscious of the language I use, both to the bad guy and to the clients, so that I don't trigger something. And I think also understanding sort of the mechanics of the threat actors is important. So, as you know, I'm sure everyone on here knows that a lot of these guys are an organization. They're part of an organization, and depending on which group you're talking about, they may be a very low level employee that you're interfacing with, at the start of negotiation with the ransomware actors. It's likely in a lot of cases that the person that you're interacting with initially doesn't speak English at all. And so what they're putting in the text chat is a script, which means that when I put something in there in English, what do? Right? They take it and they put it into like a translator. So understanding not just where they're coming from and what their language is, but the tone and context of the language I use and how that might impact them emotionally is important. And it's subtle, but it's super important.
Do you, Kurtis, I'm just curious, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have an instance or time where there was maybe one word that you used that translated to something different, or vice versa, and kind of took maybe a couple back and forths until you kind of figured out what was going on or where the misunderstanding was?
Yeah, actually, there's been a few incidents like that, and one I can't remember the word in Russian, but and we have colleagues. My colleagues, Sigrid, since that speak Russian, so I was able to tap them in the scenario. But trying to explain to the threat actor about a municipal organization that they had impacted and how that municipal organization, fits into the overall ecosystem. They had made an assumption about that organization that was not correct. And, my common use of our words for, a county, for example, didn't translate correctly in Russian. And it was my colleagues that pointed that out. They said, hey, here's why this is a problem. They think this means that. And the word you want to use is this. And so, yeah, that happens a lot. And then one of the things we do with the client is, because this is such a weird sort of medium that we're doing this on, there's a lot of room for fraud or the accusation of fraud when you're a middleman between the dark web chat and the client who's been impacted. And so we do a lot of stuff to try to make that as transparent as possible. And part of that is we don't send anything to a threat actor without the client's approval and understanding of what we're saying and why we're saying it and our desired outcomes and so on. That gives the client the ability to potentially edit, and they do. And sometimes the clients will come back and say, I think we should tell them this. And I'll say, well, I appreciate that. And we can use some version of that, but this word you're using, this $10 word you're using, I don't know how that translates in Ukrainian. So we're not using that word, right? So we have to kind of dial it back. And so it's funny how the languages kind of get mixed up in this.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ryan. One thing, you had mentioned about being a therapist, both to the client and the threat actor. One thing that I've noticed, it seems that the more information that the client has about kind of what's going on behind the scenes, they're very curious. Because for me and Ryan and Kurtis, I'm sure, we go through this quite often, but for them, a lot of times it's the first time, and they just, why are they doing this? Why did they target us? Like, they don't understand where they're coming from, and they're trying to kind of wrap their mind around everything that's going on. And it seems like when you bring in someone that's experienced, like yourself, to interact and talk with them, there's this level of comfort that comes right away from just asking, the same kind of, you probably hear the same questions, over and over again. Why are they doing this? What's their motivation? How much can we get them down? But just being able to talk to somebody and through the process and what to expect and, what comes next, and kind of having that all laid out at the beginning really seems to kind of put them, I don't want to say at ease, but they immediately begin to start feeling better once they start talking to somebody like you that has experience going through the whole thing.
Well, yeah, and by the way, I want to say a disclaimer that I mean no disrespect to actual therapists who have degrees and do this for a living. I use one of those. It's part of my general healthcare discipline, and I respect them. And so my apologies for flippantly using the word therapist, but you're right, and I think just human nature, it's the psychology in general. Humans don't like uncertainty, and so what you just said, like me coming in saying this, I've done 150 of these things, and this is what I know. This is, and some of the things I think that may be valuable for the audience. A lot of people have expectations about the threat actor's behavior based on, their life and context, and they're far off the mark, right? So like one of the things that I tell clients is, and also it varies from group to group, but the larger groups, for example, I'll say, hey, I know this is the most important thing in the world to you because your business is down and you're freaking out, and it's not to them. They've got 50 other clients or victims, right? And so when we do send a message, do not expect them to go, hey, and respond right back. And I even tell them, I was like, hey, we've had cases where the bad guys are like, hey, we're going to go to the lake this weekend, so we'll talk to you on Monday. Right. So just setting those expectations that this is, we are not in control here. And these are some expectations around how this might go. It's pretty powerful.
Or like the ransomware actors like to call their victims their partners.
Partners, clients. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Isn't that cute? So Two things, folks. First and foremost, please drop any questions you might have in the chat. Interact with us. We'll interact back with you. You know how that works.
Yep. And except also, for John DiMaggio. John, don't heckle me.
One comment, cut him off. Also, just want to throw this out there. Take your mental health seriously, especially if you're working in our field. Burnout is very, very common. I'm well aware of that firsthand. Mm-hmm. So just throwing that out because we talked about.
Yeah, no, that's great. I agree.
Yeah, big time. I have a psychologist too, and some other doctors. I'll just like us on. So yeah, take care of your mental health. Reach out. Okay, TA profiling, threat actor profiling. So give us an overview, if you could, good sir, of what generally is profiling.
Well, I think there's a shift occurring right now that aligns with kind of the topic of this, which is more about the human part of it. I think traditional threat actor profiling, which is actually valuable, is largely technical. So it's TTPs. Right. And things like that. Those things are extremely valuable for defense stuff. But also I think it's when you couple the TTPs with the human element of it, the personalities behind it, that it becomes even more powerful in informing an organization about either defense strategies so that it doesn't happen to you, but also in your response strategies. And so we do a lot of tabletops and things like that. And I like to build in some of these, and I take them from actual, real world scenarios. I like to build in some of these human elements in the tabletops so that people sort of understand that it helps reinforce that, hey, the thing on the other side of this attack isn't a thing; it's a person, and that person has a background, a family, beliefs, ideologies, motivations. Maybe it's their job, right? Some of these people just work for these organizations. They're not the kingpin, right? And so working that in there is important. And one of the things I talk briefly about in my upcoming book, Cyber Recon, is how we can get more of that data at scale than we used to be able to do. So with all of the if you think about it, like if you're going to profile someone, like from a personality perspective, what do you really need? Well, you need to either have a conversation with them, which is an option, but that's expensive and time consuming, and sort of tactical in nature, or you need to observe them in other human interactions, right? Objectively. Well, I mean, we've been scraping dark web for 10 years, right? So we've got, and now Telegram and Discord and all these other things. So we've got literally, a decade of bad guys talking to each other, right? And that data is extremely valuable at scale. And I think before, Gen AI and all these other things, that was difficult to make sense of. But now I think, across the data sets, doing proper correlation and coupling that with the human element, and then attaching the TTPs and technical elements to that as part of the overall, what I call TA dossier, is valuable.
One thing I noticed, and it really got me to focus on trying to understand, like put myself in their perspective and really see how some of these threat actors think. The Maze group, or the Maze Cartel, as they wanted to be known as, in 2019 was they were not the first, but they were like the big one to move to the, whether we call it the second or third stage, whatever,
Right.
of extortion, but data exfiltration and then holding that over the victim's head, which is now often par for the course. Right. They released, they call it a press release, and it's actually in our 528 course. I have a screenshot from their data leak site, and I'm searching for it in my PDF right now. There it is. Right. In July of 2020, the Maze team came out and on their leak site, and they said that essentially, I'll paraphrase here because it's kind of long. They said, "We know the world is in a global pandemic. Everyone is hurting financially, but guess what? So are we." Basically, in a nice way, I guess if you want to call it a nice way, we don't care. Like it doesn't matter to us. Right. And they literally said, from now on, it will be 3 days. And if you don't respond to us from our initial encryption events, basically, right, giving you our contact info, which is typically via their ransom notes, which means, oops, you're already in trouble, that we'll just leak your data. And then that was like, oh, wow. Like they're acknowledging, we don't care. You're all hurting. We know that you're all hurting, but we're still going to do what we do. And then the Ragnar Locker group, and I don't remember which year, I apologize, 22, 23, I think, but I don't remember. They came out and said that if we identify anyone working with a third-party organization, including negotiators or law enforcement, then we are going to immediately leak your data, delete your keys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was like, you see this, we refer to it as, pressure that they're putting on to their victims. And it just gets you inside the minds of some of these folks to realize that some of these groups will negotiate quite well, actually. And I'm sure you can speak to that, initial offer of, let's just say $5 million US dollars. And then all of a sudden it's 800,000, right? And then other groups are like, it's $5 million. So pay it. And if you don't pay it within X number of days, their little countdown timer expires. Oh, now it's double, and you can really see some of the groups just have different outlooks. And you'll also see in whether they call it terms of service or whatever, some of the groups will say, we will not attack hospitals. We will not attack, certain types of organizations because we realize that that's a little too far, And then other groups are like, we don't care. Like, we don't care at all. So do you take those types of things into consideration when it comes to like mapping the groups and understanding their mentality?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And going back to what we talked about earlier, informing the client about those things on the first call to say, hey, we do know these guys, and there's certain groups where like, hey, they will never discount below 6 figures or whatever. Like we just based on our experience. So if that's out of your budget, then, we need to come up with a new strategy. So yes, absolutely 100%. And you're right. Some of the bad guys have also read Getting to Yes and never split the difference. Shame on Chris's publisher for translating that into Cyrillic. So we recognize them using our tools. Like we started seeing groups starting, they were like, touche, and then they started doing the same thing, and we had to pivot. And to the first part of your comment where they threatened Ragnar Locker, and a few other groups had done this too, saying like, look, on their blog saying, look, if we find out that you're using a professional negotiator, we'll blow this up. We'll delete the decryption key and dump your data. And that does shift strategy too, because in negotiation, having a foil to use is great for setting tone and foreshadowing, things like that. So to say, like somebody says, hey, this is the number, and you go, oh man, I don't know if the board's going to go for that, right? Like, I don't know if my team, you start foreshadowing, and it has value, in the actual negotiation strategy. And so right away, or that my client's not going to go for that right away, it kind of changes how you can use that tool. And yeah, it's been interesting watching it change over time.
Okay. You have a certain number of categories that you've created/identified in terms of the type of threat actor. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, these interviews are always hard because I don't, and I do some examples in the book, but I don't want to give away, too much of the secret sauce either. So it's like this balance of of sharing these things. But certainly you can. I think there's buckets. As I talk about in my book, I say there's these larger buckets, which I think we've traditionally put them in, like APT and cyber criminal and lone actor and so on. And then there's like sub buckets underneath those, and that's where you really start applying the human element to it. Is and most of the time, if I'm just looking across the spectrum, I think that it ties to motivation and ideology is how you start making those sub buckets. They're going to behave completely differently if it's a business than if it's than if they're after you because of your ideological stance or your religion, and they're targeting you that even if it's financially driven, they're targeting you because of that. And so what we're trying to do is take the combination of the TTPs, the human element that we're using in the, like, observing the conversational data and any direct interactions we have with the threat actors, which we have a lot of those at Group Sense. But one of the things we've gotten well known for is threat actor engagement, where we talk to the bad guys on behalf of the client, with some of our personas. Coupling all that together to really tighten up those subcategories so that we can then come back and say, and it works bidirectionally, by the way. You can say from a defense standpoint, because of who you are as a business, or because the fact that your CEO is very public, advocate for this or whatever, these are the threat actor groups that you need to, prioritize defending against. On the flip side, it's like, if we are doing like your job, Ryan, if we're doing threat hunting and you see these TTPs in your, these IOCs, then we're probably dealing with John, or whatever. It's Alex. That's my favorite. Alex is our adversary, and guess what I know about Alex, right? And so that's it's super valuable in both directions, right?
Yes, I love that. We have some comments. One from Anastasia, a comment saying sympathy versus empathy towards cyber criminals when engaging with them. Extremely important to truly understand where they're coming from. When I first got into cyber, as some folks like to just call it cyber, I work in cyber, was a number of the communist camps in, for example, Russia, from the fall of, a lot of them were converted over to IT camps. And basically, the wave of the future was IT. And so the general IT and computing and learning to code and learning to hack, but in terms of hacking code. And as they trained so many of these people up, and then yet as their economic situation continued to decline, they started looking around and realizing, well, what skills do I have in order to feed my family? And you fast forward to now, and it makes the kind of like, oh, okay, as a preteen or a teenager, they were exposed to all of these skills and obtained some fantastic skill sets and ended up putting them to use in a way that we may not love, you know?
Yeah. And I think to just draft off that for a second, like, you know, if you understood that the threat actor you're dealing with, you know, is from Donetsk, and, you know, John will appreciate this, and, you know, their family owns a cheese shop and their mom's been sick and whatever. And they're keep in mind, like they're looking at Western media and they see us, you know, as it's portrayed in Western media, driving around in our Porsches and whatever. The sympathy and empathy they have towards us gets dialed down to almost zero pretty quickly. And it's not that we condone that or say that what they're doing is okay. We would still arrest them if we had the chance. But it's important to understand that when you're interacting with them, right? Or defending against them.
That's an excellent point. I was thinking like from us to them, and then not even realizing what you just brought up about their perception of us over here, whether or not that's true or not, also comes into play. And I would imagine, you know, it would also be for the companies that you're negotiating on the behalf of. And kind of to that end, are there any, you know, you mentioned tabletop exercises before that you do with companies, maybe to kind of prepare them for something like this. Are there anything that companies can do ahead of time if they find themselves in a position where they're going to be entering into negotiations, or something that they can do proactively? Because a lot of times when I think proactive, it's going to be, you know, the threat hunting, you know, trying to keep them out. But is there anything they can do proactively to kind of get them ready for something like this if it does happen and they reach that negotiation stage?
Mary, I'm really glad you asked that. That's one of my favorite soapboxes. But before I answered, I wanted to also say that, you know, I believe, and we have colleagues that came from those places. And so we've had lots of conversations about this. I have, you know, family members that came from those places and speak those languages and know that culture. And, you know, generally speaking, it's never good to overgeneralize, but generally speaking, I believe that sometimes these guys don't even think that what they're doing is truly harmful. They think we can afford it, right? They're like, oh, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Like I'm going to take $1 million, but you'll be fine, right? And you're still going to drive your Porsche home tonight. You're fine, right? So with the exception of, like, you know, attacking critical infrastructure in hospitals, I think a lot of times these guys can justify to themselves based on their perception of Western culture that this is not that harmful. It's weird. But as far as what clients or organizations can do to, in advance of an attack, for the human element of this, I think a couple of the things that when we're helping companies refine and draft their incident response planning, a lot of the stuff that gets left out, like, for example, not only do we chair tabletops, but we often attend other tabletops run by other vendors as, like, sort of an advisor or liaison. And I've seen so many times where even well-known, you know, IR firms are coming in, and the first thing they do is, in the scenario, is they throw the ransom note up, and the ransom note says, we want $10 million, right? I have never seen a ransom note with a number on it. And so that particular point in the interaction is super important, because the question is, we've been attacked. They've claimed to have taken our data. You know, maybe our systems are impacted, operationally impacted, but we don't know how much they're going to ask for. And the question is, do we talk to them at all? And that gate is super important. And a lot of the decision points for that gate they're softer. They're not always technical. There's some obviously financial components, and we help with financial sort of calculation matrices and things like that. You know, putting value on, you know, like how much money you're losing per minute is super hard for any company, no matter how sophisticated they are. But you want to make a run at that anyway, just to get a rough order of magnitude, so that, you know, like, hey, these guys always ask for $50 million, and we can only spend 500,000. It doesn't make any sense to even talk to them, right? But the other points are, I like to talk about, is it against your values? So I'm big at running a values-based organization, and it's those moments where those values are inconvenient that it is most important to reinforce them. And if you have values that would conflict with, for example, negotiating with a criminal or a terrorist or whatever, and then the first time you're presented with a very difficult scenario where it might be convenient to do that, and you just walk right past that value, all of your values are useless going forward for your entire organization. They're just useless, And so I know that sounds kind of silly and soft, but I think it's super important. So that's one of the things we talk about even on the planning side is like, hey, let's, or from an organization in values perspective, let's make a decision now before the incident ever happens, how we feel about this. And does it align with our corporate values and our personal values? The other one is obviously legal, right? So you don't know whether the bad guys are on a sanctions list or something like that, or the impacts. And if you're a global organization, which many of our clients are, there's different rules in different places, and where you have your HQ is relevant, but not necessarily 100% of the equation. And so there's a lot of that stuff. But I think walking through the financial components and the organizational value components and the legal components in advance of any incident and putting that as part of your plan and working that into the tabletop is super important. That was a long answer.
That was a good answer. I really like that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Speaking of good stuff, Ethan from the chat. What's up, Ethan? How you doing, man? My old boss checking on me. It always makes me chuckle when they say you're paying for services, is what Ethan says. Now, for folks out there who may not be aware, on the dark web forums, you hit Tor and you go to a forum site and log in, whatever. They often will refer to the people who do the dastardly deeds for, especially like the ransomware as a service organizations, where the developers maintain the malware, the infrastructure to maintain the malware and callbacks and things of that nature. And then they essentially lease it out to others, to the affiliates, to do their dastardly deeds and get them within the environment. Those folks might even go and simply use an initial access broker, or just literally pay an initial access broker for access into a given environment. But anyway, we often see them being referred to as pen testers on the forums. They'll actually say like pen testers wanted. And then in the notes, sometimes it'll be super vague, like need really strong pen testing skills, highly paid, contact us. And like, pen testing for what? And then other times, right? And then other times it literally is like, yeah, we're so-and-so ransomware group. We want a pen tester. And basically they mean we want someone who once we get in, or once entry is obtained, you go do all the horrible stuff. And we have seen many cases where where the threat actors are like, yeah, so you're basically paying for our services. We performed a pen test and we demand to get paid for it. And then
a gratuitous pen test. That's just hacking, guys. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's also a good question from, actually, there's a couple good ones here, from Andre. Were there cases where hackers agreed to no payment, but decided to give back the decryption key after a negotiation?
Very, very few, but yes, there have been. Or the payment was actually, this is actually a great, I'll draft off of that too for Andre, but you just mentioned that the threat actors may engage with a initial access broker. That's somebody who breaks into the organization and then goes on the darknet markets and sells that access to whoever will pay them for it. And then usually the ransomware actors are buying that and then deploying their ransomware. For example, we had a case where they had hit a fairly large charity that it was a cancer. It was actually a mobile breast cancer screening charity years and years ago, and they had a copy of the finances. That's something else we can talk about too. They had a copy of their finances. They knew how much money they had in the bank. They knew, kind of what their donations were and so on. And they asked for $2 million, and that would just put the organization completely out of business at that point. And so that's, there's a whole bunch of nuances to how we have to explain business to these bad guys. But, we said, hey, look, like 100% of that money, these guys aren't, they don't have fancy offices. They got little mobile vans. They drive around. They're just helping people not die. Can you just let this one go? And the bad guys came back to us and said, well, what do you think is a reasonable price? I said $0 It's a reasonable price. And they said, well, we can't do that. Our cost of goods is $5,000. Cost of goods, right? They actually use like cost of goods. So, go back to the business, we're dealing with business people here. They paid some, initial access broker $5,000, and they're like, can we have our $5,000 back and we'll give you the key? Yes, you can. $5,000 is affordable compared to $2 million. And so we've had a handful of cases where we've been able to do that. But it does illustrate that there's a whole marketplace and sort of industry behind this on the bad guys side, right?
So, Kurtis, we have some other good stuff in the chat, but I want to make sure with our last 20 minutes here, we're about 2/3 of the way through this, we get a little more into the TA profiling stuff. So how can some organizations who might not be doing profiling currently, do you have any tips and tricks or any kind of methodologies they can utilize, keeping in mind that every darn vendor out there, including the ones we probably all work for, use their own terminology for various threat groups?
I feel so bad for the enterprises. Yeah, it's confusing.
Well, Microsoft and CrowdStrike are joining up to try to help everyone do a whole thing.
Normalize that.
Yeah, that's good. But we all use different terms, right? And anyways, I'll digress on that. So getting into TA profiling, what are some, general, whether it's tips and tricks on how to get started or just some of the things you can speak to about, how you go about doing so, mapping TTPs to personalities and attitudes and whatnot?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I hate to overgeneralize. I think it's unreasonable to expect the average enterprise to even try to do this themselves. I mean, it's going to be something vendor driven for 99.9% of the market. Maybe large financials and some governments will build out teams that can do this stuff themselves. So it is going to be, and I'm glad to hear, I didn't know about that. I'm glad to hear there's going to be some normalization there. I'm after my book launches, or right around when my book launches, I'm putting up a TA dossier site that kind of walks through what I believe is sort of the best practices around this, and I'm hoping that other vendors will adopt it as well, or draft off of it and improve it. So I think, to your point, just aside from the naming, I think in general, sort of the way that this gets done on a vendor by vendor basis and how that data is stored and shared, and it's all over the place right now. So we're kind of on the beginning, I think, phase of, and I think Gen AI is helping solve some of this, but in the beginning phase of the normalization of the profiling, the human elements of profiling of the threat actor beyond just TTPs and IOCs. And so that's a long answer to say there's no real good way to do it, right now that's standardized. And, I'm hoping to help sort of drive that narrative as it develops, across the vendor space.
One of the things I look at is I always find a way to bring them up on everything I do these days, just because scattered spider is CrowdStrike's term, but that was the one that was popularized initially and thus used quite often. Palo Alto calls them muddled Libra. We've got Storm name from Microsoft, Octa Tempest from it. All kinds of different names for this group.
Right.
Not only do we say things like what I just said, this group. Right. But anyone who's done analysis on scattered spider knows that they're an offshoot of the community or the COM, which is 1,000+ members strong. And when it comes to scattered spider activity, recently we've seen them go crazy in terms of moving from one vertical to the next. They used to find a vertical and then very purposefully and actively try to get into those particular organizations that they chose from that vertical. They were doing SIM swapping, and then they moved over to, just blanked out, SMS-based phishing, often using like an attacker in the middle framework, like Evil Jinx 2 or whatever. And now you just see a ton of them just calling the help desk. Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I got locked out, and I need you to reset all my security stuff. Oh, you will? Thank you. That kind of thing. But we see that like they were hitting so many, UK retail in 2025, and then over to insurance, and then this belief of aviation and all these things that are coming out. And you start to think, okay, we already thought they were a very splintered group, but they're hitting so many organizations in these little like just packs at one time. Like, how many of them actually are there? And is the group that we call Scattered Spider and the group that you call Muddled Libra, is it the same group at all? Like, is it even the same people? And one of the things that I've noticed that's a tie-in for like all of the scattered spider stuff that I've seen is that they are the epitome of don't care. They will literally, I almost said a client. No,
I do it too.
My client, a victim will shut down a virtual machine, and they'll spin it back up and bring up Notepad and put a dirty, nasty note. You don't turn this off. We're gonna like they don't care. Like essentially, right? I mean, that's one of the things that common thread. But I totally agree with you that it is very difficult for the majority of organizations out there to engage in profiling. First off, to even have a lens wide enough to see, the breadth of attacks from given groups, or to see overlap in TTPs and perhaps IOCs and things of that nature, let alone to be able to have a team to research that. And many times when you engage in incident response, it's not the IR team who's running the threat profiling. It's the TR, the threat research, or the threat intelligence team that's part of that firm that's they're feeding information back and forth. So one of the things I always say for like first parties, if you're not a consulting service or whatnot, is to use your events/incidents to your advantage of profiling what you've already dealt with before. And a lot of times people don't use that as like a repo, and they really should be doing that. Big time.
Right. No, that's great. That's a great tip. I mean, if you don't learn from your own mistakes and shortcomings, it was it fool me once kind of thing. But no, I agree. And I did see a question I wanted to comment on. I think it's Andre. It said, did Kurtis deal with any high ransomware breaches related to critical infrastructure, OT? Yes. So yes, and that's interesting too, because not only have I dealt with critical infrastructure, but just OT attacks in general, or compromising OT systems has become more and more common. And we had cases where the threat actors were able to shut down, like for a large municipality, across a county, they shut down the HVAC systems in all of the offices. And at first glance, it's like, well, we just got over COVID. We're kind of all used to working from home anyway, and it was like a hot summer, right? And so we're like, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal was they also shut it off in the county prison. And so they had to bus prison. So the money and risk associated with busing prisoners to the next county to put them in temporary holding, I mean, the impact's huge. And on the critical infrastructure side, when I moved to Colorado a few years ago, I launched a program called RAPIDS, which is an acronym that I created that I don't remember what it means. But basically, it's a cyber center of excellence around the protection of industrial control systems along the Colorado River, for the mechanization of the Colorado River. And we were able to get funding on that. So we do a fair amount of research on the threat actor groups targeting, critical infrastructure systems and OT systems related to, water quite a bit.
That's awesome. First off, we're going to toss up a link in a moment here. Kurtis, we're familiar with, because we include it in our SANS course on ransomware, that guy right there. Well, that's my shortened link, so that doesn't really tell you what it is at all. But it's the Ransom Chat project. Are you familiar with that guy?
I am. I'm not super familiar, but I am familiar. Yep.
Basically, first off, horrible way to put my guest on the spot.
Yeah, no worries.
Are you familiar with that? I don't know what you're talking about. Thanks, Ryan.
I mean, I've been looking at everybody's, chat repos and things like that across a bunch of different, places. So, yeah.
So about that. Yeah. For folks who have not seen it yet, that link, for528.com/ransom-chat, is a really cool project that basically over 20 different malware variants, some of them dated by now, but you can actually see some of the chats that go on between the victim organization and whoever they have negotiating for them and the threat actors. So Kurtis, do you know of any other resources, or are there any other locations, or people out there want to kind of know, like, what do these really look like? Yeah. And I'm wondering what resources might be out there.
Yeah, and they're kind of ephemeral. So sometimes like we'll get like a chat GPT spun up that instance, an LLM spun up to go through these, and then it'll go away. And then, but I think ransomware.live has some good ones. I think Dark Web Informer has some good ones as well, that has captured quite a few of the group's chats with the victims that are interesting. And we take the ones, we don't publish any of ours for various reasons, but we do take them and we do feed them into a private LLM that we use sometimes to do on our tabletop exercises. How cool is it that I don't even know what the injects are, right? Because the AI, the robots tell me on the fly, right? So that's fair. That's pretty realistic when the responder doesn't, the person doing the tabletop exercise doesn't even know what they're going to say next. And it's based on a lot of the data from our incidents that we fed into those LLMs. Yeah.
I love that you said that. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love that too. My keynote is going to be on the topic of how to use AI, kind of in our day to day. And I think that is a great example, especially generative AI, of doing something like that, making a tabletop more interactive and spontaneous, which will mimic
and harder. Sometimes it's frustratingly good at being the bad guy. And it's like, wow, that's a tough one that it just threw at us. So I've had a few that kind of surprised me.
That's great. I love it.
Mary, your keynote, where and when? What are you talking about?
Oh, the DFIR Summit, and that's when it's going to be how to DFIR AI's your workflow. So we're going to talk about, well, like you, Kurtis, you said, I'm assuming local LLM. Well, that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about is how to use a local LLM so you don't have to be as worried about privacy and sending your information off somewhere else, and how we can leverage that in our daily work stream. So I'm not, like a data scientist, or, I don't do machine learning. I'm coming from this, like from a practitioner's perspective, like, hey, there's this cool thing. How can I really start leveraging it and using it to make my workflows better? And Kurtis, I think that's just a great example that you gave of how you're using it. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun. And it took us, the training took us quite a while to get it to where we were comfortable using it in real world TTXs. But we've now done it pretty successfully. So it's nice.
That's great.
I just love the dynamic nature of an organization comfortable enough to run a TTX that way. Thank you so much. When people have like, oh, we got 10 slides, we're going to do slide 1 and then 2 and then well, hold on. What if in slide 1, the client says, yeah, blah, blah, blah. But
it should be a choose your own adventure.
Yeah. Like
it requires quite a bit of forethought on the person curating this to do it correctly. You're right. And a lot of the ones I've sat in on have been sort of this linear path. And I was like, well, none of them really work that way,
Yeah, IR cases aren't playbooked out necessarily.
And one thing we've done on a couple that were really interesting, because we actually had this happen a few times in the real world, is have multiple attackers. So, a lot of our incident response plans and tabletops don't take into account that it doesn't just have to be one opponent, and that really muddies the forensics sort of in the negotiation sort of strategy quite a bit when you've got multiple bad guy parties who are not collaborating involved.
So we're getting close to time here. I do want to point out that Samuel in chat asked a very good question that I'm going to answer. Is that from LinkedIn? It is. If attack services are scaling exponentially with IoT and AI, where exactly can humans still intervene faster or more effectively than automated systems? That's a phenomenal question. We definitely did. I was waiting to get to it, and I was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to it just yet. I'm going to respond to that personally in LinkedIn, Samuel, and get your response to that, because the dwell time is decreasing crazily these days, and the time to data exfiltration is decreasing like crazy. So without going on a product pitch for my company, you'd be like, oh, I use our automation. But I will go off and I'll respond to that. So thank you for that awesome question. I'm going to copy and paste it into my little notepad here, so I remember to reply. And the other question, is there a recommended training or how-to guides for security executives? That pretty broad, because there's so much. It just says LinkedIn user on my screen. I can't see exactly who it was. If that person who asked that question could expand upon that question a little bit, I will reply to that also and make sure that we get a good response to you.
Can I throw like a quick one out there on that?
Heck yeah.
Just to security leadership. The same thing we started this whole session about, saying the bad guys are humans, so are your team. They're people, and they get burnt out, and morale and all that stuff is severely impacted on an incident, and just something to remember and work into your plan, like rotations and stuff like that. So
Okay, so first off, Kurtis, thank you much. This was an awesome conversation. I like the dynamic nature of it. I like the feedback from the folks online. I love seeing all my old buddies in the chat, like, oh, I still care about me.
Right.
Kurtis, where can folks go to find you, your upcoming book, etc.?
So it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and it will be in myriad bookstores and things like that. You can pre-order it now. Thank you, by the way, for allowing me to do that. It is my first book. It's by Wiley Press. And the kind of the point of the book is, I don't know if my links will come through on this post, but the purpose behind it is to explain sort of the inner workings of the cyber espionage industry, why it exists, who does it, who they do it to, and why, and all this other stuff. And so I'm also noticing every time I post something, it posts twice. I don't know, but you can go to kurtisminder.com. It's Kurtis with a K, and that's you can get links there. And or if you need to talk to me or need advice is typically free from me. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome, thank you, good sir. And Mary, where can folks find you coming up?
Let's see. Well, I'll be in London next week. I leave on July 4th. I'll be teaching 500 over there. Then I'll be in Utah at the DFIR Summit the end of the month. I want to say it's like August 20-something, 22nd, 25th. I don't know. Not August, July. I'm already thinking 1 month ahead. So I'll be there. Those are my next 2 teaches coming up. And the keynote at the DFIR Summit.
Oh,
congratulations.
And the keynote. Whatever. Well, folks, if anyone's interested in taking Forensics 528, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion with me live online, just following the DFIR Summit. It's kind of funny because Mary and I teach our course, and yet we're competing at the summit. We're like, no,
I know. I wish you were teaching out there. Are you going to be out there, Ryan, physically?
No,
or are you going to be
online? I'll be online.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah, but you can use for any of the courses, I believe, but especially for 528. You can use code SUMMIT*600 to get $600 off. Forensics 528, not 500. Don't take 500. I'm kidding.
I see how it is.
Did you see your face?
I'm coming up to Phoenix this weekend. You're in trouble, Ryan.
Did not do that. No, I took 500 initially back in 2000, I don't know, 13, 14, and fell in love with our realm because of it. So yeah, I'm just messing with you. I'll be doing a workshop at DEF CON 33. This is going to be my 6th year in a row doing a workshop there. They are free. However, when they begin registration, they go very quickly. So just a heads up on that. Ours is called Putting EDRs in Their Place, Killing and Silencing EDR Agents. And my part is related to ransomware because they love to use EDR killers, basically. Yep. So be sure to check in with us and stay tuned for the next Stay Ahead of Ransomware live stream, the first Tuesday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Kurtis, thank you again. Mary, as always, thank you, and appreciate all of you for joining us today. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.